The frozen corpse in the bunkhouse was positioned exactly like the others we'd found, arms crossed over its chest, eyes sewn shut with what looked like fishing line, but this one was still warm. The October wind cut through my jacket as I loaded the last of our gear into Marcus's truck. 3 days of supplies, camping equipment, and enough camera gear to document what we hoped would be the find of a lifetime. Marcus had discovered the location through old forestry records. Harrowfield Logging Camp, abandoned since 1987 after what the documents only described as operational difficulties. "You sure about those coordinates?" I asked, watching him double-check his GPS unit for the 5th time. "Positive," Marcus replied, his breath forming clouds in the freezing morning air. "Took me 6 months to track down the exact location. The company tried to scrub it from the records, but I found an old surveyor who remembered the place." The drive from Anchorage took us deeper into wilderness with each passing hour. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to barely maintained logging roads that hadn't seen proper use in decades. Our third companion, Bryant, dozed in the back seat, occasionally stirring when the truck hit particularly deep ruts. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the forest pressed closer. Sitka spruces towered on either side, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the afternoon light. The radio had given up finding signals an hour ago, leaving us with only the sound of the engine and the crunch of frozen ground beneath our tires. "There," Marcus pointed to a gap in the trees, barely visible through the overgrowth. "That's our turn." The access road was more suggestion than reality. Fallen branches scraped against the truck's sides as we pushed through. 20 minutes of careful navigation brought us to a clearing where the forest suddenly opened up, revealing our destination. Harrowfield Logging Camp sprawled before us like a wound in the wilderness. 24 buildings in various states of decay lined what had once been the main thoroughfare. The structures seemed to lean inward, as if the forest was slowly reclaiming them, pulling them back into the earth. "Home sweet home," Bryant muttered, finally awake and peering through the windshield. We parked near what appeared to be the main office, its door hanging open like a broken jaw. The silence that greeted us when we cut the engine was absolute. No birds, no wind, nothing but our own breathing and the tick of the cooling engine. "Notice anything strange?" I asked, shouldering my pack. Marcus scanned the buildings. "Besides the fact that this place looks like it was abandoned yesterday instead of 37 years ago?" He was right. Despite decades of abandonment, the building showed remarkably little decay. Paint still clung to the walls, windows remained mostly intact, and even the company sign, Harrowfield Lumber Company, hung straight and legible above the office door. We established our base camp in the clearing's center, away from the buildings. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, long shadows stretched across the camp like reaching fingers. The temperature dropped rapidly, and we hurried to gather firewood before darkness fell completely. That first night, gathered around our fire, we reviewed what little information we had about the camp's closure. The official records were frustratingly vague. Production had ceased in November 1987, all personnel were relocated, and the site was abandoned. No explanation for why a profitable operation would suddenly shut down, leaving millions of dollars in equipment behind. "The surveyor I talked to," Marcus said, poking at the fire with a stick, "he mentioned something about the workers. Said they started refusing to work the night shifts, then the day shifts. By the end, they wouldn't even come up the mountain." The fire crackled, sending sparks into the darkness. Beyond our small circle of light, the abandoned buildings waited, their black windows watching us like empty eye sockets. Morning brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere. If anything, daylight made the camp more unsettling. We could see details we'd missed in the evening, tools left mid-job, as if the workers had simply vanished. A chainsaw rested against a half-cut log, its teeth still buried in the wood. Trucks sat with doors open, keys in ignitions. We split up to cover more ground, each taking a section of the camp to document. I headed for the bunkhouses on the eastern edge, my camera ready. The first building I entered made my skin crawl. Beds were still made with military precision, personal effects scattered on nightstands, photographs, books, even half-empty coffee cups covered in decades of dust. In one room I found a journal. The pages were yellowed but legible, filled with the mundane entries of a logger named Patterson. I flipped to the final entries dated November 1987, November 3rd. Another man quit today. That makes 12 this week. The foreman won't say why, but we all know. The sounds at night are getting worse. November 5th. Found Kowalski's hard hat in the woods. Just the hat. Management says he went home, but his truck's still here. November 7th. They're in the walls. God help us. They're in the walls. The entries ended there. I photographed each page, my hands trembling slightly. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Stress, isolation, maybe carbon monoxide from faulty heaters. But something about the desperate scrawl of those final words made my stomach turn. Moving to the next bunkhouse, I found more of the same. Abandoned belongings, beds that looked slept in, and an overwhelming sense that everyone had left in a hurry. But it was in the third building that I made the first truly disturbing discovery. The door to room 12 was locked from the inside. I could see through a crack in the wood that something had been used to barricade it, furniture piled against the door. After several minutes of prying with a crowbar from the truck, I managed to force it open. The smell hit me first. Not decay exactly, but something organic and wrong. The room was different from the others. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges in the wood that looked like claw marks. The window had been boarded up from the inside, and in the corner, I had to step outside to catch my breath. In the corner was a mass of blankets and clothes, arranged almost like a nest. Dark stains covered the fabric, and scattered throughout were small bones. Too small to be human, thankfully, likely rodents or birds, but the deliberate arrangement made my skin crawl. "Guys," I called into my radio, "you need to see this." Marcus and Bryant arrived within minutes. Their reactions mirrored mine, disgust mixed with morbid fascination. "What the hell happened here?" Bryant whispered, photographing the scene from every angle. We spent the rest of the day finding similar rooms throughout the camp. Not in every building, but enough to form a pattern. Barricaded doors, scratched walls, and those strange nests. Always in corner rooms, always on upper floors. As afternoon wore on, we made another discovery. Bryant had been exploring the equipment shed when his shout brought us running. Inside, past rows of abandoned machinery, he'd found a section of floor that had been deliberately removed. Beneath was a rough-hewn tunnel, disappearing into darkness. "That's not part of the original construction," Marcus said, shining his flashlight into the opening. The tunnel was maybe 4 feet wide, carved directly into the frozen earth. The walls showed tool marks, but also something else, those same claw-like gouges we'd seen in the bunkhouses. "We're going down there, aren't we?" I said, already knowing the answer. "Tomorrow," Marcus decided, "with proper equipment and all three of us together." That night we huddled closer to the fire than before. The abandoned buildings seemed to press closer in the darkness, and several times I caught myself staring at the black windows, certain I'd seen movement. "Did you hear that?" Bryant asked suddenly, his head snapping toward the tree line. We listened. At first, nothing but the pop of burning wood. Then, faint but distinct, a sound like scratching, like claws on bark. It moved through the trees circling our camp at a distance. "Probably just an animal," Marcus said, but his hand moved to the hunting knife on his belt. The scratching continued for hours, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. We took turns keeping watch, but whatever made the sound never showed itself. When dawn finally broke, we found marks on several trees near our camp, long, deep scratches that started 8 feet off the ground. We entered the tunnel at first light, roped together for safety. The passage descended at a steep angle, requiring us to move in a controlled slide at times. Our headlamps cut through the darkness, revealing more of those claw marks along the walls. After what felt like hours but was probably 30 minutes, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. We emerged into a space that shouldn't have existed, a natural cave system that the tunnel had broken into. But it had been modified. Wooden supports held up sections of ceiling, and crude platforms had been built along the walls. "This isn't on any geological survey," Marcus muttered, consulting his maps. The cave stretched beyond our light's reach. As we moved deeper, we found more evidence of human activity. Tools scattered about, more of those platform structures, and then Bryant's light fell on something that made us all freeze. Bodies. Multiple bodies in various states of preservation. The cold had mummified them, leaving leather-like skin stretched over bones. They wore the remains of loggers' clothing, but it was their positioning that made my hands shake. Each body had been carefully arranged, arms crossed over chests, eyes sewn shut with what looked like fishing line. "We need to leave," I said. "Now. Call the authorities. Let them—" A sound cut me off. From deeper in the cave came a wet, sliding noise, like something large dragging itself across stone. We turned our lights toward the sound but saw only more darkness. Then the smell hit us. Decay and something else, something animal and wrong. The same smell from the barricaded room, but 100 times stronger. We ran. There's no shame in admitting it. We scrambled back through the tunnel, not caring about rope safety or proper climbing technique. Behind us, that sliding sound grew closer, accompanied by a rhythmic clicking that might have been claws on stone. We burst from the tunnel into daylight, gasping and wild-eyed. Without discussion, we grabbed essential gear and made for the truck. But as we reached it, Marcus cursed. All 4 tires had been shredded, long tears in the rubber that looked deliberate. "The radio in the office," Bryant said. "Emergency services." We sprinted for the main building. The radio was old but functional, and after several tries, we raised a Forest Service station. The ranger who answered sounded skeptical at first, but something in our voices must have convinced him. He promised to send a helicopter at first light, weather permitting. That left us with 12 hours until rescue. We barricaded ourselves in the office, pushing desks and filing cabinets against the doors and windows. As darkness fell, we took inventory of our situation. We had food, water, and weapons. Marcus's knife, a hatchet from the truck, and a rusty shotgun Bryant had found in a desk drawer with a handful of shells. The scratching started just after sunset. Not distant this time, but right outside our makeshift fortress. Something circled the building, testing each window, each door. The old wood groaned under pressure. "Maybe it's the survivors," Bryant whispered. "Maybe some of the loggers survived down there, went feral." The window behind him exploded inward. What came through the window defied easy description. In the split second before Bryant fired the shotgun, I saw pale flesh, too many joints, and eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's. The blast caught its center mass, driving it back through the window with a sound between a scream and a hiss. Black fluid splattered the walls where it had been. Not blood. Something thicker, with an oily consistency that made my eyes water from the smell. That wasn't human. Marcus stated the obvious, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. We reinforced the broken window as best we could, but we all knew it was futile. Whatever these things were, they were strong enough to tear through our barricades if they wanted. The only question was why they hadn't already. The answer came in the form of voices, human voices, calling from outside in the darkness. "Help us," a man's voice pleaded. "We've been down there so long. Please, we just want to go home." "Don't listen," I said, though the voices were convincing. "The bodies in the cave were decades old." "Please," a woman's voice now crying. "It's so cold. We can see your light. Just open the door." The voices multiplied, became a chorus of pleading, crying, begging. Some claimed to be injured loggers, others lost hikers, all desperate, all perfectly human-sounding. But underneath their words was that clicking sound, like mandibles or claws tapping together. Bryant covered his ears, humming to block out the sound. Marcus and I took turns watching the windows, catching glimpses of shapes moving in the darkness. Not quite human shapes, too tall, joints bending in wrong directions, but always just out of clear sight. The psychological assault continued for hours. The voices grew more personal, more specific. They knew our names, mentioned details about our lives they couldn't possibly know. At one point I heard my mother's voice, years dead, calling my name from outside. "How do they know?" Bryant asked, uncovering his ears during a brief silence. The journal mentioned they were in the walls, I said. Maybe they've been here all along, listening, learning. As if in response, the scratching resumed, but this time from above. The ceiling creaked as multiple somethings moved across the roof. Dust rained down with each step. Marcus aimed the shotgun upward. We had 3 shells left. The hatchet and knife seemed pitifully inadequate. I gripped a broken chair leg, knowing it was useless, but needing something in my hands. The assault on the roof stopped. Silence stretched, broken only by our ragged breathing. Then, from directly outside the door, came a new voice. Not pleading this time, but conversational. "We were like you once," it said, the words slightly slurred as if the speaker's mouth wasn't quite shaped for human speech. Curious. Exploring. We found the old places, the deep places. They welcomed us. "What are you?" Marcus called out. A laugh or something like it. "We are what waits. What has always waited." The company knew near the end. "Why do you think they sealed the records?" "But you opened the door." "You always open the door." The office's lights flickered. We'd been running off the camp's old generator, and it chose that moment to sputter. In the brief darkness, I saw them clearly through the window. Dozens of pale forms standing motionless in the clearing. Some wore the remnants of loggers' clothing. Others were naked, their skin stretched over frames that had grown too large, too wrong. The generator caught, lights flaring back to life. The clearing was empty. "Above us," Bryant whispered. The ceiling exploded downward. They poured through the hole like a nightmare made flesh. Pale, elongated limbs, too many joints, faces that might once have been human but were now stretched and distorted. Their eyes reflected our lights, and their mouths, God, their mouths opened too wide, showing rows of teeth that belonged in no earthly creature. Marcus fired, the shotgun blast deafening in the enclosed space. One creature fell, that black fluid spraying. Bryant swung the hatchet, connecting with another's reaching arm. I thrust with my makeshift spear, trying to keep them at bay. But there were too many. They moved with horrible grace, spider-like in their ability to cling to walls and ceiling. One dropped behind Bryant, and before we could warn him, elongated fingers wrapped around his throat. "Run!" Marcus shoved me toward a back door I hadn't noticed before. We burst through into a hallway, the sounds of Bryant's struggles cutting off with terrible finality. We ran deeper into the building, taking turns at random, trying to lose our pursuers. The office complex was larger than it appeared from outside, corridors branching off into rooms we hadn't explored. Behind us came the clicking of claws on wood, getting closer. A door appeared marked Archives. We ducked inside, barricading it with filing cabinets. The room was windowless, filled with decades of records. As we caught our breath, I noticed files scattered on a desk, as if someone had been reading them recently. Marcus grabbed one, scanning quickly. Expedition logs from 1952. A geological survey team found something underground. Natural caverns with evidence of pre-Columbian habitation. I found another file. 1971, workers report strange sounds from below the camp. Company brings in experts, but they disappear. Then 1983, 3 loggers go missing. They seal the entrance to the caves. But something got out, Marcus said. Or someone let it out. The door shuddered as something slammed into it from outside. We had minutes at most. Marcus reloaded the shotgun with our last 2 shells while I searched desperately for another exit. Behind a tall shelf, I found it. A service hatch leading into the walls. "The journal," I said as we crawled into the narrow space. It said they were in the walls. The service tunnel was barely wide enough for us to move single file. We crawled in darkness, not daring to use our lights. Behind us, we heard the archive door splinter. They were inside. The tunnel branched multiple times. We chose directions at random, trying to work our way toward the outside wall. The space was filled with pipes and wiring, some of it recent. Too recent for a camp abandoned in 1987. We emerged in what looked like a machinery room. Generators, modern ones, hummed quietly. Someone had been maintaining this place. keeping it powered. But why? A calendar on the wall showed the current year, with dates marked off until last month. Notes in the margins mentioned feeding times and population counts. Someone's been taking care of them, Marcus said, horror dawning in his voice. Feeding them, studying them maybe. Or worshipping them, I added, remembering the carefully arranged bodies in the cave. A ventilation grate near the floor caught my attention. Through it, I could see outside, our camp, the fire still burning. The helicopter wouldn't come until dawn. We had to survive until then. But as we watched, shapes moved between the buildings. Dozens of them, more than we'd seen in the office. They congregated around something in the center of the camp. As my eyes adjusted, I realized what it was. Bryant's body, arranged in that same careful position. Arms crossed, eyes already sewn shut. They moved around him in what looked like a ritual, their elongated forms swaying in unison. "We're not getting out," Marcus said quietly. "Not past all of them." That's when we heard footsteps. Human footsteps, steady and unhurried, coming down the hallway toward us. The door opened, revealing a man in his 60s wearing a park ranger's uniform. He looked perfectly normal, even friendly, except for his eyes. They had the same reflective quality as the creatures outside. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, as if finding us hiding wasn't surprising. "I'm Ranger Harrison. I maintain this facility." Marcus raised the shotgun. Harrison didn't flinch. "That won't help," Harrison said. "They allowed me to find you. They're curious, you see. It's been so long since we had visitors who made it this far." "You're feeding them," I accused. "Taking care of those things. Caring for the transformed, yes." Harrison smiled, revealing teeth slightly too sharp. "I was like you once, investigating the disappearances. But when I understood what this place was, what it meant, I chose to stay, to serve." "You're insane," Marcus spat. "Am I? This place is a threshold, a point where our world touches something far older. The original inhabitants of these mountains knew. They fed it, appeased it. When the logging company came, they disturbed the balance." Harrison walked to a window, gazing out at the ritual below. "The first to change were terrified, but transformation is a gift. To become something more than human, to join with the eternal. The company tried to contain it, hide it. But you can't hide from gods that dwell in the earth itself." "Gods?" I asked, trying to keep him talking while looking for escape routes. "Call them what you like. They've slept in the deep places since before humans walked upright. This camp, these mountains, are honeycombed with their tunnels. The loggers broke through into their domain. Some fled, some fought. The wisest surrendered themselves." Outside, the ritual reached some kind of crescendo. The creatures' movements became frantic, almost ecstatic. In their center, Bryant's body began to twitch. "He's dead," Marcus said. "We saw him die." "Death is a human concept," Harrison replied. "They preserve the flesh, remake it. Your friend will rise soon, confused at first, but he'll understand in time, as will you." Bryant's body sat up with jerky, unnatural movements. Even from this distance, I could see his limbs were already longer, joints beginning to bend in new directions. "The helicopter," I said. "Forest Service will—" "I am the Forest Service," Harrison interrupted. "Who do you think called them off?" "Weather concerns," I said. "Maybe in a few days. By then, you'll have joined your friend, and I'll report another group of hikers lost in the wilderness." Marcus pulled the trigger. The blast caught Harrison in the chest, throwing him backward. But instead of falling, he laughed. Black fluid seeped from the wound as he straightened up. 20 years ago, that might have killed me," he said. "But I've been changing too, slowly, carefully, maintaining enough humanity to serve my purpose here." His fingers elongated as we watched, skin stretching like taffy. "You can't fight this. But if you surrender, I promise the transformation will be gentle. Fight, and they'll take you anyway, but the process, well, your friend fought." Through the window we could see Bryant, or what had been Bryant, moving with the others now. His gait was wrong, spider-like, but getting smoother with each moment. "Choose," Harrison said, his voice distorting as his jaw began to reshape. "Join willingly, or—" Marcus shot him again, the last shell tearing into Harrison's head. This time he fell, black fluid pooling beneath him. But already we could see movement beneath his skin, things writhing, reshaping. We ran. The service tunnels became our maze. We crawled, climbed, and squeezed through spaces that seemed to get narrower with each turn. Behind us came sounds of pursuit, not just the creatures now, but Harrison's voice, impossibly still talking despite what the shotgun had done to his head. "You're only delaying the inevitable," his distorted voice echoed through the walls. "Every human who enters these mountains belongs to them eventually. We're just the latest in a long line stretching back millennia." We emerged in a sub-basement I hadn't known existed. Ancient wooden beams supported earth and stone. This wasn't part of the logging camp. This was older, much older. Symbols were carved into the support posts, pictographs that hurt to look at directly. Native warnings, Marcus guessed. But I wasn't sure. The symbols seemed older than any human culture. The basement opened into natural caves, the same system we'd found earlier, but a different section. These tunnels were smooth, as if worn by the passage of something massive over countless years. The walls glistened with moisture that seemed to move on its own, reaching toward us with microscopic tendrils. We had no choice but to go deeper. The sounds of pursuit had stopped, which was somehow worse than being chased. Were they hurting us, leading us somewhere specific? The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, larger than our lights could fully illuminate. But we could see enough. The walls were covered in a honeycomb of alcoves, each containing a form in various stages of transformation. Some might have been human once, others were older, stranger, things that had never walked on two legs. In the center of the chamber was a pool of black liquid, perfectly still like a dark mirror. As we watched, ripples appeared on its surface, though nothing had disturbed it. "The source," Marcus whispered. "This is where it comes from." Bioluminescent growths provided dim light, revealing more details we didn't want to see. The alcoves weren't just storage, they were changing chambers. We could see the process happening in real time, flesh restructuring, bones elongating, humanity dissolving into something else. One alcove near us contained a form still recognizably human, though barely. The face was partially visible, and with horror, I recognized him from a photograph in the archives, one of the geological surveyors from 1952, still changing after 70 years. "God," Marcus breathed. "How long does it take?" "Forever," Harrison's voice came from behind us. He stood at the tunnel entrance, his head reformed but wrong, too many eyes blinking in the dim light. "That's the beauty of it. Constant change, constant evolution, never dying, always becoming." Beside him stood Bryant, or the thing wearing Bryant's stretched skin. It moved in stop-motion jerks, still learning its new form. "Join us," Bryant Thing spoke, its voice a mockery of our friends. "It doesn't hurt after the first century." We backed toward the pool. The black liquid seemed to pulse with eagerness. "That's right," Harrison encouraged. "One touch is all it takes. Willing contact makes the transformation smoother. You'll thank me eventually." Marcus grabbed my arm. "Together," he said quietly. "If we're going to become those things anyway." I understood. Better to die human than live as whatever they'd become. We turned toward the pool, ready to throw ourselves in, hoping drowning would be faster than transformation. But as we moved, the liquid recoiled. It pulled away from us, creating a depression in the pool's surface. Harrison made a sound of confusion. "That's not—" "It always accepts offerings." I remembered something. Frantically, I dug in my pocket, pulling out the small silver cross my grandmother had given me years ago. I'm not religious, had forgotten I even carried it. But as I held it up, the creature stepped back. "Folklore," Harrison hissed. "Superstition. That shouldn't work." But it was working. The pool continued to retreat from us. The bioluminescent growths dimmed. Even the transformed seemed affected, their movements becoming sluggish. Faith, Marcus said, understanding dawning. Not the object, but belief itself. Human belief, human will. Enough! Harrison lunged forward but stopped short of the cross's imagined barrier. You think your little faith can stand against eons of existence? We were here before your God was imagined. Maybe so. But as I gripped that tiny cross, believing with every fiber of my being that it could protect us, the creatures couldn't approach. We backed toward another tunnel, keeping the cross raised. This won't last, Harrison called after us. Your faith will waver, and when it does. We ran again, but this time with purpose. The cross seemed to guide us, growing warmer when we chose correctly. Up and up we climbed, through tunnels that gradually became more worked stone than natural cave. We emerged through a hidden entrance in the forest, miles from the camp. The first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees, and never had sunlight looked so beautiful. Behind us, we could hear them following, but they stopped at the tunnel mouth, unable or unwilling to pursue into daylight. We ran through the forest, crashing through undergrowth, following the slope downward. My lungs burned, legs shook, but we couldn't stop. As the sun climbed higher, we heard the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. We broke into a clearing just as the Forest Service helicopter was passing overhead. Marcus fired our flare gun, the one thing we'd managed to keep throughout the night. The helicopter circled back, beginning its descent. As we waited, I looked back toward the mountains. Smoke was rising from the direction of the camp. Not wood smoke, something darker, oilier. Were they burning evidence? Preparing for the next group of investigators? The helicopter touched down and we scrambled aboard. The pilot, a different ranger, asked about our emergency. We gave him a prepared story: equipment failure, wild animal attack, our friend missing. He radioed it in, promising a search team. They never found Bryant's body. The camp, when investigators arrived, showed clear signs of arson. All the buildings had burned, destroying any evidence of what we'd experienced. Ranger Harrison was never found, and Park Service records showed no employee by that name. Marcus and I were treated for exposure and exhaustion. We told our story to anyone who would listen, but without evidence, who would believe us? The authorities concluded we'd suffered shared delusions brought on by carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty camping equipment. But I know the truth. And late at night, when I close my eyes, I can still see that pool of black liquid, feel the walls pressing in, hear Harrison's voice promising transformation. I still carry my grandmother's cross, though I'm not sure it would save me a second time. The Harrowfield logging camp remains officially closed, the access road blocked. But I've done research. Every few years, hikers go missing in those mountains. Search teams find nothing, and sometimes, just sometimes, a survivor emerges with wild tales of pale creatures in the dark, of impossible tunnels, of things that wait in the deep places of the earth. They're diagnosed with trauma, given therapy, and sent home. Just like us. But I see it in their eyes. The same knowledge, the same fear. We've seen what lurks beneath the thin veneer of our reality, and we know it's still there, waiting, patient as stone, waiting for the next group of curious explorers to open the door. Because we always open the door.
By 2018, my friend Jake and I had been hiking companions for nearly a decade. We had traversed the dense forests of Washington and Oregon together, endured the scorching heat of southwestern deserts, and conquered the challenging peaks of the Sierra Nevada side by side. Our experiences had forged a deep trust between us, the kind that develops only through shared hardships and triumphs in remote wilderness areas. After years of exploring familiar territories, we craved something more demanding, more isolated, more primal. That's when Jake suggested the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, or simply the Frank, as seasoned outdoorsmen call it. Located in Idaho and spanning over 2 million acres, it represents one of the largest contiguous wilderness areas in the continental United States. The name itself carried an ominous weight that should have been our first warning. "It's the real deal," Jake said one evening as we studied maps in my apartment. "No cell service, minimal ranger patrols, and terrain so rough that most tourists never go beyond the first few miles of marked trails." His eyes gleamed with anticipation as his finger traced potential routes across the topographic lines. We'd have the place practically to ourselves. I studied the map, noting the vast distances between access points, the dramatic elevation changes, and the numerous river crossings. "It looks intense," I admitted, "much more isolated than anything we've done before." "That's precisely the point," Jake responded, leaning back in his chair with a smile that revealed both confidence and challenge. "Are you getting hesitant? Because I can always ask someone else." That subtle provocation was all it took. 3 weeks later, we were methodically packing our gear for what would become the most harrowing experience of my life. The evening before our departure, I stood in my living room surrounded by equipment: ultralight tent, sub-zero sleeping bag, water filtration system, first aid supplies, topographic maps, compass, GPS unit, dried foods, cooking equipment, and clothing for all weather conditions. Everything had been meticulously selected, balancing weight against necessity. I recalled the warnings I'd read online about the Frank, stories of experienced hikers who had disappeared, accounts of sudden weather changes that trapped people for days, and tales of encounters with wildlife that ended badly. Warnings that I had dismissed as exaggerations designed to keep novices away. That night, I barely slept. An inexplicable unease had settled in my chest, not the usual pre-adventure excitement, but something darker, more foreboding. In retrospect, perhaps it was intuition trying to warn me, but I ignored it, attributing the sensation to normal pre-trip anxiety. Dawn brought clarity and determination. We loaded my Subaru Outback, secured the roof rack, and began the long journey northward from California into Idaho's rugged interior. The drive took nearly 2 days, the landscape gradually transforming from the familiar to the foreign. Civilization thinned out as we progressed, small towns giving way to isolated gas stations, then to nothing but wilderness. By late afternoon of the second day, we arrived at a small graveled trailhead near the middle fork of the Salmon River. A weathered wooden sign displayed a crude map of the area, along with faded warnings about bear activity and current fire restrictions. The parking area was empty except for a single dusty pickup truck at the far end. "Looks like we have the place to ourselves," Jake observed, stretching after the long drive. His voice carried an edge of satisfaction that I initially mistook for simple enthusiasm. We unloaded our packs, performed final equipment checks, and locked the car. I remember hesitating, looking back at the vehicle, our last connection to the world we were leaving behind. For a moment, I considered suggesting we postpone, start smaller, perhaps try a less remote section. But pride silenced my concerns. As we shouldered our packs and took our first steps onto the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced toward the pickup truck, but saw no one. The only witnesses to our departure were the ancient pines that towered above, their branches swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. "Ready for the best hike of your life?" Jake asked, already several paces ahead. I forced a smile. Born ready. Neither of us could have anticipated what the Frank had in store for us. The first day progressed without incident. We maintained a steady pace along a well-marked trail that wound through dense pine forest. The air was crisp and fragrant with the scent of evergreens and earth. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. We covered approximately 8 miles before making camp near a clear, gurgling creek. The routine was familiar. Jake set up the tent while I filtered water and prepared a simple meal of dehydrated chili. We ate in comfortable silence, occasionally commenting on the day's hike or pointing out wildlife. That first night in the wilderness was peaceful, almost deceptively so. The stars blazed overhead in numbers I'd forgotten existed, their light undimmed by urban pollution. I fell asleep to the gentle sounds of water flowing over stone and wind whispering through pine needles. The second day brought more challenging terrain. The trail narrowed and began to climb, switchbacking up ridges and descending into valleys. The underbrush thickened, sometimes encroaching on the path until we had to push through tangled vegetation. Conversation dwindled as we focused on negotiating the increasingly difficult landscape. By late afternoon, we had penetrated deeper into the wilderness than either of us had anticipated. The marked trail had become less distinct, occasionally disappearing entirely before reappearing several yards ahead. At times, we relied on cairns, small stacks of rocks placed by previous hikers, to guide our way. "We're making good time," Jake remarked during a brief water break. He studied our position on the map, tracing our progress with his finger. "Another day like this and we'll reach the canyon overlook. The views there are supposed to be incredible." I nodded, conserving energy. My legs ached from the day's exertion, but it was a satisfying discomfort, the kind that comes from pushing physical limits in pursuit of something worthwhile. That evening, we pitched our tent on a relatively flat area protected by a stand of ancient cedar trees. The location offered a partial view of the valley below, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. We boiled water for our freeze-dried meals, the steam rising in the cooling air. Jake seemed unusually quiet during dinner, his gaze repeatedly drawn to the deeper wilderness that extended beyond our campsite. When I asked what was on his mind, he simply shrugged and said, "Just thinking about tomorrow's route." But there was something in his expression, a tension around his eyes, a slight furrow between his brows, that suggested more was at work than simple route planning. I slept fitfully that night, awakening several times to unfamiliar sounds. The distant howl of a wolf, the sudden snap of a branch, and once, what sounded like voices carried on the wind, though I dismissed this as the product of dreams blending with reality. The third day dawned gray and cool, with low clouds obscuring the mountain peaks. We ate a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, packed up our gear, and resumed our journey. The trail had become increasingly difficult to follow, sometimes disappearing completely beneath fallen trees or washed-out sections. Around midday, Jake stopped abruptly and turned to me with an expression that combined excitement with something else, something almost predatory. "I'm thinking we should go off-trail," he suggested, gesturing toward a densely wooded area to our right. "The real Frank is out there, not on these tourist paths." I hesitated. Going off-trail meant abandoning the security of a marked route, relying instead on our navigation skills and equipment. It meant entering territory where help, if needed, would be significantly harder to find. "Are you sure that's wise?" I asked, scanning the imposing forest. "We're already pretty deep in." Jake's expression hardened slightly. "I thought you wanted an adventure. If you're scared, we can stick to the kiddie trail." His words stung, as they were meant to. We had been friends long enough for him to know exactly how to provoke me. I knew I was being manipulated, but pride overrode caution. "Lead the way," I said, adjusting my pack straps. Jake grinned and immediately veered off the trail, plunging into the thick underbrush. I followed, pushing aside branches and ducking under low-hanging limbs. The change was immediate and disorienting. Without the trail as reference, the forest seemed to close in around us. Trees grew closer together, their trunks wider than my shoulders, their roots creating a chaotic maze across the forest floor. Moss draped everything, muffling sound and dimming the already subdued daylight. The ground underfoot became a spongy carpet that sometimes gave way unexpectedly. Our progress slowed considerably. We had to navigate around fallen trees, deep ravines, and dense thickets. The visibility was poor, rarely extending beyond 50 yards in any direction. More than once I found myself turned around, temporarily losing sight of Jake and feeling a surge of panic before locating him again. The air grew heavier, filled with the rich scent of decay and growth, the smell of a forest largely untouched by human presence. Birds called from unseen perches, their voices strange and somehow ominous in the filtered light. After perhaps 2 hours of this challenging travel, Jake suddenly stopped, his head tilted slightly as if listening. I paused beside him, my breath coming in controlled gasps from the exertion. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first, I heard nothing beyond our breathing and the ambient sounds of the forest. Then it reached me. A low, steady hum, distinctly mechanical and completely out of place in this wilderness setting. We exchanged glances but said nothing. By unspoken agreement, we moved toward the sound, curiosity overriding caution. The hum grew louder as we pushed forward, eventually resolving into what I recognized as distorted music, heavy and aggressive, with screaming vocals barely discernible beneath layers of electronic distortion. After a few minutes of careful progress, we broke through a thicket of young saplings and found ourselves facing the source of the sound. A concrete bunker, partially sunken into a low rise, its steel door hanging slightly ajar. The concrete exterior was covered in bizarre symbols, circles, zigzags, and lines that formed no recognizable pattern. The music emanated from within, pulsing like a heartbeat of something malevolent. We stopped a few yards from the entrance, suddenly aware of how exposed we were. The bunker seemed profoundly wrong in this setting, a human intrusion of the most jarring kind, not a ranger station or hiker's shelter, but something secretive and threatening. "What the hell is this place?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the throbbing music. Jake shook his head slowly. "No idea. Military, maybe? Or some survivalist compound?" I studied the symbols scratched into the concrete. They appeared crude but intentional, possibly ritual in nature. The music continued to pulse from within the partially open door, heavy and violent. "Should we check it out?" Jake asked, his voice carrying an undercurrent of excitement that alarmed me. "Are you insane?" I hissed. "We have no idea who's in there or what they're doing." The sensible course of action was obvious. Retreat quietly and continue our journey, perhaps reporting the location to rangers once we returned to civilization. But as we stood there, I realized a disturbing truth. Part of me wanted to look inside, to solve the mystery of this anomalous structure in the middle of nowhere. Before we could decide, fate intervened. A sudden gust of wind carried the scent of cigarette smoke to us. Someone was outside the bunker, possibly watching us right now. I caught Jake's eye and tilted my head back in the direction we had come. He nodded, understanding immediately. We turned and began to retreat, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. We had covered perhaps a few hundred yards when the forest around us changed. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint immediately, not a sound or a sight, but a feeling, as if the air itself had become charged with hostile intent. "We're being followed," Jake whispered, voicing what I already suspected. We quickened our pace, no longer concerned with stealth but with putting distance between ourselves and the bunker. Branches scraped against my arms and face as I pushed through the dense vegetation. We were discussing who would build such a structure in this remote location when two figures materialized from the trees ahead, as if they had been waiting for us. They wore full camouflage gear with balaclavas concealing their faces. Each held what appeared to be an AK-style rifle, barrels currently pointed downward but gripped with obvious readiness. My entire body tensed as Jake and I stopped, frozen in place. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. The only sound was our labored breathing and the distant thump of music from the bunker behind us. Then one of the men raised his rifle, pointing it directly at us. "On your knees," he commanded, his voice flat and emotionless. "Arms up." I glanced at Jake, whose hands were moving toward the straps of his backpack. In that moment, I realized we were in genuine danger. These weren't park rangers or even ordinary hunters. The remoteness of our location, the hidden bunker, the concealed faces, everything pointed to people who operated outside the law. As I slowly raised my hands, Jake made his move. In one fluid motion, he unclipped his pack, let it drop to the ground, and bolted to the right, disappearing into the trees. The sudden action broke my paralysis. I released my own pack straps and ran after him, zigzagging between tree trunks. A shot cracked through the air, deafeningly loud in the confined space of the forest. Bark exploded from a tree to my left, showering me with splinters. I ducked instinctively but kept running, my lungs burning and heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, I heard someone shouting, "Cease fire! We need them alive!" The words sent a wave of terror through me, more potent than the gunfire. Whatever these men wanted us for, it wasn't something I was willing to discover. More shots followed, lower now, kicking up dirt around my feet. They were aiming to wound, to slow us down, to capture rather than kill. This realization propelled me forward with renewed desperation. Jake was ahead of me, weaving through the trees with the agility of someone whose life depended on it, which it did. I matched his pace, grateful for the years of hiking that had conditioned my body for this kind of sustained exertion. The gunfire eventually stopped, but we continued running until our legs threatened to give out. When we finally stopped, both of us were gasping for breath, bodies trembling from adrenaline and exertion. "I think we lost them," Jake managed between gulps of air, leaning against a tree for support. We listened intently, hearing nothing but the natural sounds of the forest and our own ragged breathing. No footsteps, no voices, no gunfire. But the absence of pursuit offered little comfort given our new reality. We were now deep in wilderness territory without our packs, which meant no food, no shelter, no maps, and no emergency equipment. As the initial surge of adrenaline faded, the gravity of our situation began to sink in. We were truly alone, truly vulnerable, and night was approaching. The first night without our equipment was an exercise in misery. As darkness enveloped the forest, the temperature dropped rapidly. Without sleeping bags or tent, we were at the mercy of the elements. We huddled against a fallen log, pulling our jackets tightly around us in a futile attempt to conserve body heat. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but thirst was the more immediate concern. We had found a small stream before nightfall and drunk our fill, but without containers to carry water, we would need to locate new sources regularly. Sleep came in brief, troubled intervals. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the cracking of branches under the weight of nocturnal creatures, jolted me awake, convinced that our pursuers had found us. In the darkness, my imagination populated the shadows with armed men creeping closer, their rifles aimed at our sleeping forms. Jake seemed equally vigilant. We spoke little, each lost in private calculations of survival and escape. Dawn brought a bone-deep chill and renewed awareness of our hunger. We found a bush with small berries that Jake identified as safe to eat. They were sour and barely ripe, staining our fingers purple as we picked them, but they provided minimal sustenance. "We need to keep moving south," Jake said, studying the position of the morning sun through gaps in the canopy. "That's our best chance of reaching the trailhead." I nodded, too exhausted for conversation. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and my mouth felt dry despite having drunk water recently. The first signs of dehydration I recognized, not severe yet, but concerning nonetheless. We walked all day, stopping only to drink from streams and forage what edible plants we could find. The forest stretched endlessly around us, trees so numerous and similar that progress felt illusory. Were we actually moving toward safety or merely wandering in circles? Without maps or GPS, certainty was impossible. By evening, blisters had formed on my feet, each step becoming increasingly painful. Jake wasn't faring much better. I noticed him wincing whenever he put weight on his right ankle. We found shelter under an overhanging rock formation, not ideal, but better than complete exposure. The night was clear, allowing the temperature to drop even lower than the previous evening. We couldn't risk a fire that might attract our pursuers, so we endured the cold, shivering violently as darkness settled around us. "Who do you think they were?" I asked, breaking the long silence. Jake stared into the darkness. Militia, maybe, or drug operations. This area is perfect for anyone wanting to stay off the grid. What would they have done if they'd caught us? He turned to me, his expression grim in the faint moonlight. Let's be grateful we didn't find out. I fell into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of men in masks dragging us back to their bunker, down into darkness where the pounding music never stopped. I awoke multiple times, heart racing, convinced I'd heard footsteps approaching. The third day brought weakness and disorientation. My vision occasionally blurred at the edges, and standing too quickly caused dizziness. We found more berries and some edible roots, but our bodies were operating at a severe caloric deficit. We need protein, Jake muttered, scanning the forest floor for signs of small game. And fat. We can't keep going like this. But we had no weapons, no traps, no means of hunting. We trudged onward, each step requiring conscious effort. Conversation dwindled to essential communication only. Warnings about difficult terrain ahead, notifications of water sources, brief consultations about direction. The forest had transformed from a place of adventure to one of menace. Every shadow concealed potential threats. Every unexpected sound triggered a surge of adrenaline. The wild, which had once been our playground, had become our prison. Late in the afternoon, Jake suddenly stopped, raising his hand for silence. I froze, straining to hear what had caught his attention. "Engine," he whispered, pointing to our right. At first I heard nothing. Then it reached me. The distant but unmistakable sound of a motor vehicle. It could mean salvation or danger. There was no way to know which. We moved cautiously toward the sound, pushing through dense underbrush until we emerged onto a narrow dirt road, little more than a rutted track cutting through the trees, but unmistakably man-made. Civilization, I breathed, feeling a surge of hope for the first time in days. Jake nodded, but his expression remained cautious. Could be anyone's road. Might lead to a ranger station. Might lead back to them. We debated briefly before deciding to follow the road. Even if it didn't lead directly to safety, it would eventually connect to larger roads and, ultimately, to people who could help us. We walked for perhaps an hour, staying just inside the tree line rather than on the exposed road itself. A compromise between making good time and maintaining caution. The road curved and dipped, following the natural contours of the land. As we rounded a bend, a small wooden structure came into view. A ranger station, its windows glowing with warm light in the fading day. A pickup truck with National Park Service markings was parked outside. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that my knees nearly buckled. Jake placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, his own expression revealing the same profound emotion. "We made it," he said simply. We approached the ranger station slowly, aware of our appearance. Filthy, scratched, clothes torn, faces gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. The ranger who opened the door took one look at us and immediately ushered us inside. "Good Lord, what happened to you boys?" he asked, already moving to pour coffee and retrieve first aid supplies. He was an older man with a gray beard and weathered face, his uniform bearing the faded patch of someone who had served in the wilderness for decades. His name tag identified him as Ranger Wilson. As we sipped hot coffee with trembling hands, we recounted our experience. The bunker, the strange symbols, the armed men who had pursued us, our desperate flight through the forest without supplies. Wilson listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When we finished, he picked up his radio and contacted local police, providing our location and a brief summary of our story. Then he turned back to us. "You're lucky to be alive," he said simply. "That area has a history of problems." "What kind of problems?" Jake asked. Wilson sighed, seeming to weigh how much to tell us. "The Frank is big," too big to patrol effectively. Over the years, it's attracted people who want to disappear. Some are just off-grid types, harmless enough. Others are more dangerous. Militia groups, survivalists with extreme views, even criminal operations. And the authorities just let them stay out there? I asked, incredulous. It's complicated, Wilson replied. Limited resources, jurisdictional issues. Sometimes we know generally where these groups are operating, but without specific evidence of criminal activity, there's not much that can be done. And when there is evidence, mounting an operation in terrain like this is extremely difficult and dangerous. 2 police officers arrived about an hour later. They took our statements, their expressions professional but skeptical, in a way that suggested they'd heard similar stories before. They promised to send rangers to investigate the bunker location, based on our best attempt to describe its position. We spent the night at the ranger station, sleeping on cots that felt luxurious after our nights on the forest floor. In the morning, the police returned with news. The rangers had found the bunker, but it was empty. No people, no equipment, just the concrete structure with its bizarre symbols scratched into the walls. Our backpacks were nowhere to be found. These groups are mobile, one officer explained. They probably cleared out as soon as they realized there were witnesses in the area. They'll likely relocate to another section of the wilderness. The implication was clear. They were still out there, just somewhere else now. The thought sent a chill through me despite the warmth of the ranger station. After providing us with meals and basic medical attention for our various minor injuries, Ranger Wilson drove us back to our car at the trailhead. It sat exactly as we had left it, a surreal reminder of how dramatically our circumstances had changed in just a few days. The drive home was largely silent. Jake stared out the passenger window, his expression unreadable. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, replaying events in my mind, questioning decisions, wondering about alternative outcomes. The wilderness that had once been a source of joy and escape had revealed a darker aspect, a reminder that not all dangers in the wild come from nature itself. The physical recovery came quickly. Within a week, the blisters had healed, the scratches had faded, and the persistent ache of hunger had become a distant memory. The psychological aftermath proved more enduring. I found myself startling at unexpected sounds, even in the safety of my apartment. Sleep became elusive, disrupted by dreams of pursuit through endless forests or of masked men dragging me into darkened bunkers. During waking hours, I was hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats that weren't there. Jake and I spoke infrequently in the weeks following our return. When we did talk, our conversations were superficial, deliberately avoiding discussion of what had happened in the Frank. It was as if acknowledging the experience would somehow make it more real, more present in our lives. 1 month after our return, Jake called unexpectedly late one evening. "I've been doing some research," he said without preamble, "about the Frank and the symbols we saw." I felt a tightening in my chest. "Why? It's over. We got lucky. Best to leave it behind us." "Is it, though?" His voice had an intensity that alarmed me. "Don't you want to understand what we stumbled into?" "Not particularly," I replied, though this wasn't entirely true. Despite my attempts to move forward, questions lingered in my mind. Who were those men? What purpose did the bunker serve? What did the symbols mean? But pursuing answers seemed dangerous, a path leading back toward experiences I was trying to forget. "I found something," Jake continued, ignoring my reluctance. "Those symbols, they're used by a group called the Covenant of the Sacred Earth. They're an extreme survivalist cult with apocalyptic beliefs. They think society is on the verge of collapse and are preparing for what they call the Great Cleansing." "How do you know this?" I asked, unsettled by both the information and Jake's apparent obsession with it. "Internet forums, news archives, academic papers on domestic extremism. It took some digging, but the patterns match. The symbols, the remote location, the armed security, it all fits their profile." I remained silent, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to end the conversation, to hang up and continue pretending that our experience had been an isolated incident, a random encounter with danger that held no larger significance. Another part recognized that understanding might be the only path to true recovery. "There's more," Jake said into my silence. "According to some sources, they're involved in weapons trafficking, possibly even human trafficking. They use the wilderness as a staging ground, a place where they can operate outside of government oversight." "Did you tell the police about this?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. "I tried. They took my statement but didn't seem particularly interested. One officer basically patted me on the head and suggested I was connecting dots that weren't there. "Maybe you are," I suggested gently. "We were under extreme stress. Trauma can make people see patterns." "I'm not imagining this," Jake interrupted, his voice sharp. "I know what I saw, what we saw. These people are dangerous and they're operating right under everyone's noses." The conversation ended shortly thereafter, with Jake promising to send me links to his research and me promising, half-heartedly, to review them. After hanging up, I sat in my darkened apartment, a subtle tremor in my hands as memories I'd been suppressing threatened to resurface. I didn't look at Jake's research when it arrived in my email the next day. Instead, I archived the message, telling myself I would examine it when I felt ready, a time I secretly suspected would never come. 2 weeks later, Jake called again. This time, his voice was hushed, almost conspiratorial. "I think I'm being watched," he said without greeting. "What?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "There's been a car parked across from my apartment for 3 days. Different people inside, but always the same car. And I've noticed someone following me when I go out." "Jake, listen to yourself," I urged. "This sounds paranoid. Maybe you should talk to someone, a professional." "I'm not paranoid," he snapped. "They know we saw them. They know we can identify their location. We're loose ends." "The Rangers said the bunker was empty when they checked. They've moved on, Jake. They don't care about us." "That's what they want you to think." His voice had taken on a feverish quality that alarmed me. "I'm going back." "You're what?" I nearly shouted. "I'm going back to the Frank. I need evidence. Concrete proof of what's happening out there. Photos, recordings, something the authorities can't ignore." "That's insane," I said, genuine fear rising within me. "We barely escaped with our lives last time. You can't seriously be considering going back, especially alone." "I'm not asking for your permission," Jake replied coldly. "I'm telling you because you were there. You saw what I saw. I thought you might understand." "What I understand is that you're not thinking clearly," I insisted. "Whatever is out there, it's not worth risking your life over." "Some things are bigger than individual safety," he said. "If what I suspect is true, people are being hurt, maybe killed. I can't just pretend I don't know that." No amount of reasoning could dissuade him. The conversation ended with Jake promising to contact me when he returned, an assurance that did nothing to alleviate my growing dread. 3 days later, I received a text from Jake. "Heading in tomorrow. We'll be out of contact for approximately 1 week. If you don't hear from me by the 17th, contact Detective Rivera at Idaho State Police. I've left a sealed envelope with my research and coordinates with my sister." I immediately called him, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message begging him to reconsider, then tried his sister, only to learn that he had already left Idaho Falls that morning, headed for the same trailhead where our ordeal had begun. The following week was torture. I checked my phone obsessively, slept poorly, and found myself unable to focus on work or normal activities. On the evening of the 17th, with no word from Jake, I faced a decision. Honor his request to contact the police, potentially involving myself in whatever trouble he had courted, or respect his choice and allow him the autonomy to face the consequences of his actions. In the end, conscience overrode caution. I called Detective Rivera and relayed Jake's message. The detective listened patiently, asked for details about our previous experience, and promised to look into the matter. His tone was professional but non-committal, the response of someone who had heard many such reports and found most to be unfounded. 3 days later, I received a call from Idaho State Police. They had found Jake's car at the trailhead, but no sign of Jake himself. A search operation was being organized. I flew to Idaho the next day, driven by guilt and a desperate hope that my presence might somehow aid in the search. I spoke with search and rescue teams, provided detailed descriptions of our previous route, and waited in agony for news. The search lasted 5 days before being scaled back. No trace of Jake was found, no equipment, no clothing, no signs of distress or struggle. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him. Most of the search team believed he had become lost or injured in the vast wilderness, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence. Only Detective Rivera seemed to give any credence to the story of armed men in hidden bunkers, and even his interest seemed professional rather than convinced. People disappear in the wild for mundane reasons far more often than dramatic ones, he told me gently. Exposure, falls, animal encounters, these claim more lives than human malice. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. The alternative, that Jake had been right, that he had been taken by the same people who had pursued us, was too horrific to contemplate. I returned home eventually, leaving contact information with local authorities in case new developments arose. Weeks passed, then months. Jake's family held a memorial service, though his body had not been recovered. I attended, hollow-eyed and distant, unable to share with them the full truth of what might have happened to their son and brother. In private moments, I sometimes revisited the archived email containing Jake's research. Each time my finger hovered over it, trembling slightly before I closed the application without opening the message. Whatever truths it contained, I wasn't ready to face them. A year passed. The police officially classified Jake as a missing person presumed deceased due to wilderness mishap. His case remained open, but inactive. Life continued, as it must. I no longer hiked. The very thought of entering even a local nature preserve triggered anxiety so intense it left me gasping for breath. The wilderness had been transformed in my mind from a place of refuge to one of concealed dangers and lurking malice. Sometimes, in the liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, I imagined Jake alone in the forest, pursued by masked men with rifles, calling my name as darkness closed around him. In these moments, I would startle fully awake, drenched in sweat, reaching for a phone to call for help that would never arrive in time. Other nights, I dreamed of the bunker, its door now fully open, revealing stairs that descended into impenetrable darkness. From that darkness, music thumped relentlessly, accompanied by sounds I couldn't or wouldn't identify. In these dreams, I stood at the threshold, knowing that Jake was somewhere below, waiting for me to find him, to save him. But I never entered. I always woke before taking that step. The rational part of my mind understood that these were manifestations of survivor's guilt, my psyche's attempt to process trauma and loss. But rationality offered little comfort in the dark hours when memories of those 3 days in the Frank returned with visceral intensity. 18 months after Jake's disappearance, I received an unexpected email from a journalist named Rebecca Weaver. She was writing a series of articles on missing persons cases in national wilderness areas and wanted to discuss Jake's story. My initial instinct was to ignore the message. I had already declined numerous interview requests from local news outlets and true crime podcasts, but something in her approach seemed different, more substantive than sensational. After several days of consideration, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near my apartment. Rebecca proved to be serious and well-prepared, with a stack of notes and a recorder she asked permission to use. She had already interviewed Jake's family and several members of the search team, she explained, and had reviewed the official reports. "What most interests me about your friend's case," she said after preliminary introductions, is the discrepancy between the official explanation and certain details that don't quite fit the standard lost hiker narrative. What details? I asked cautiously. For one, Jake was an experienced outdoorsman who had successfully navigated challenging wilderness before. For another, he left behind what appears to be extensive research into extremist groups operating in the Frank Church wilderness. And then there's your initial report about armed men in a bunker. A report that was largely dismissed by authorities. I stared at her, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Surprise that she had uncovered Jake's research. Relief that someone was taking the more troubling aspects of his disappearance seriously, and renewed fear at the prospect of revisiting those experiences. I don't know what Jake told you, I began carefully, but our encounter in the Frank was... I hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't make me sound delusional. Traumatic? Rebecca suggested gently. Unexplainable? Potentially criminal? All of those, I admitted, but mainly dismissed. Everyone seemed to think we were exaggerating or confused about what we saw. I don't think you were, Rebecca said, leaning forward slightly. In fact, I've found evidence that supports your account. She opened a folder and removed several photographs, placing them carefully on the table between us. They showed various wilderness locations, each containing structures similar to the bunker we had encountered. Partially concealed concrete installations with steel doors. Some displayed the same bizarre symbols we had seen. These were taken at different locations throughout Idaho, Montana, and eastern Washington, Rebecca explained. All on public land, all off the grid, all unauthorized. I stared at the images, feeling a cold weight settle in my stomach. What are they? According to my sources, they're outposts of several related extremist groups, militias, survivalists, apocalyptic cults. They use the wilderness as a base of operations precisely because it's so difficult to monitor and patrol. And the authorities know about these? I asked, struggling to process what she was showing me. Some they know about, others they don't. Resources for wilderness law enforcement are stretched incredibly thin, and many of these structures are temporary, used for a few months, then abandoned when there's any hint of official interest. She pulled out another document, this one appearing to be an internal report from a law enforcement agency, though specific identifying information had been redacted. According to this source, there's been increased activity in the region over the past 3 years. Weapons stockpiling, paramilitary training, and possibly involvement in human trafficking, specifically the transportation of individuals across remote border sections into Canada. Human trafficking? I echoed, remembering what Jake had said during our last conversation. Rebecca nodded grimly. Primarily labor trafficking, moving people who are then forced to work in illegal operations across the border. But also some cases involving... She paused, seemingly reluctant to continue. Involving what? I pressed. Ritual abuse, she said quietly. Some of these groups have extreme religious or ideological beliefs that include initiatory violence. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too confined. I loosened my collar, trying to maintain composure as memories of the bunker and the masked men collided with these new revelations. I think Jake may have stumbled onto something significant during his research, Rebecca continued. Something that made him dangerous to these groups. And I think that's why he disappeared. If what you're saying is true, I began, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Then why hasn't there been a serious investigation? Why was his case so quickly classified as just another wilderness accident? Rebecca sighed, gathering the photographs and returning them to her folder. That's what I'm trying to find out. It could be simple jurisdictional confusion or resource limitations, or the inherent difficulty of investigating crimes in such remote areas. Or what? Or there could be more deliberate reasons for the lack of official interest. Her expression was carefully neutral as she said this, but her implication was clear. You're suggesting corruption? Official protection of these groups? The idea seemed fantastical, like something from a conspiracy thriller rather than real life. I'm not suggesting anything specific yet, Rebecca replied. I'm gathering information, following leads, looking for patterns. That's why I wanted to speak with you, to hear directly about what you and Jake experienced, without the filter of official reports. I spent the next 2 hours recounting everything in excruciating detail: the bunker, the symbols, the armed men, our escape, and later, Jake's growing obsession with understanding what we had encountered. Rebecca listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing me to tell the story at my own pace. When I finished, she thanked me and provided her contact information, encouraging me to reach out if I remembered additional details or had concerns about my safety. What exactly are you planning to do with this information? I asked as we prepared to leave. Write the most comprehensive and accurate article I can, she replied. Shine light on something that's been kept in darkness for too long. Isn't that dangerous? If these groups are as violent as you suggest. She smiled slightly, though her eyes remained serious. Journalism always involves some risk when the subject matter is significant. But I take precautions, and the public deserves to know what's happening in our public lands. As we parted ways, Rebecca made one final comment that would haunt me in the weeks to come. Your friend Jake was brave. Foolish, perhaps, but brave. He recognized something important, that silence in the face of evil is a form of complicity. I returned home unsettled, my carefully constructed sense of normalcy shaken by the conversation. For months, I had managed to compartmentalize my experience in the Frank, to treat it as an isolated incident best forgotten. Rebecca's investigation suggested a much larger, more systemic issue, one that had claimed Jake and potentially many others. That night, I finally opened the archived email containing Jake's research. What I found was disturbing in its thoroughness: maps marking suspected locations of hidden facilities, timelines of known disappearances in the region, photographs taken from public records of individuals believed to be involved in extremist activities, and detailed analyses of the symbols we had seen, tracing their origins through various apocalyptic ideologies. Jake had been building a case, methodical and comprehensive, and it had likely gotten him killed. I forwarded the entire file to Rebecca, along with a brief message. Jake would have wanted you to have this. Be careful. Her reply came hours later. Thank you. This helps confirm several connections I've been tracking. I promise to use it responsibly. And yes, I'm always careful. 2 weeks passed without further communication. I returned to my routine, though thoughts of Jake and the bunker intruded more frequently now, stirred by the conversation with Rebecca and my review of Jake's research. Then, on a Wednesday evening, I received a text from an unknown number. Need to meet urgently. Information about J same place, tomorrow, 2 p.m. R. The message's brevity and urgency triggered immediate concern. Had Rebecca found something definitive about Jake's fate, or was she herself in danger now? I arrived at the coffee shop 30 minutes early, selecting a table with a clear view of both the entrance and the street outside. Rebecca arrived precisely at 2, looking considerably more harried than during our previous meeting. She carried no folder this time, just a small notebook that she kept clutched tightly. Thank you for coming, she said, sitting down and immediately scanning the room. I wasn't sure if you would. You said you had information about Jake, I replied. Of course I came. She nodded, her attention still divided between our conversation and the environment. Before I share what I've found, I need to be clear about something. After today, we shouldn't have further direct contact, for your safety and mine. A chill ran through me at her words. What's happened? My investigation has attracted attention, she said quietly. My laptop was stolen from my hotel room 3 days ago, though nothing else of value was taken. And I've noticed consistent surveillance, the same vehicles appearing wherever I go, people photographing me from a distance. God, I breathed. Have you gone to the police? A humorless smile crossed her face. With what evidence? A stolen laptop could be any random thief. And people taking pictures in public places isn't illegal. Besides, I'm not convinced all local law enforcement would be sympathetic to my concerns. She opened her notebook and pushed it across the table. Inside was a hand-drawn map with several locations marked. I've confirmed at least 7 active compounds in the region, she explained, keeping her voice low. Based on Jake's research and my own sources, they appear to be connected. Different cells of the same organization or allied groups with similar objectives. She pointed to a location circled in red. This is where you and Jake encountered the bunker, and this, her finger moved to another mark about 20 miles away, is where a hunter reported strange activity 2 months before Jake disappeared. And here, she indicated a third location, is where search teams found an abandoned campsite they believe belonged to Jake, based on personal items recovered there. I studied the map, noting the proximity of the 3 locations. You think they found him? It wasn't a question, but Rebecca nodded anyway. I think he got too close to something they couldn't allow to be exposed. My source inside federal law enforcement believes these groups are involved in weapons trafficking across the Canadian border. Military-grade hardware, not just hunting rifles. Why are you telling me this? I asked, suddenly aware of how dangerous this knowledge might be. Because my article is going to press next week, and when it does, there could be backlash. I wanted you to be prepared to take precautions. What kind of precautions? Against what? She reclaimed her notebook, closing it carefully. Against the possibility that someone might connect you to Jake's research or my investigation. These groups are meticulous about eliminating perceived threats. The coffee shop suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. I resisted the urge to look over my shoulder to check whether we were being observed even now. I'm not a threat to anyone, I insisted. I haven't done anything with what I know. Rational people would understand that, Rebecca agreed. But we're not dealing with rational actors here. These are extremists who see conspiracy and danger everywhere. In their worldview, anyone connected to exposure is a potential enemy. She stood, preparing to leave. I've arranged for the full article to be sent to you when it publishes. After that, I suggest a period of heightened awareness. Change your routines, vary your schedule, be observant of your surroundings. Not forever, just until the attention shifts elsewhere. This is insane, I said, feeling overwhelmed. All because we went hiking in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sometimes that's all it takes, Rebecca replied softly. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time can change everything. As she turned to leave, I called after her. Was it worth it? For Jake, I mean. Did his research, his sacrifice make a difference? She paused, considering the question. I believe it will. The article incorporates his findings, though I've protected his identity as much as possible. When it publishes, there will be investigations that can't be easily dismissed. For the first time, these groups will face real scrutiny. After she left, I remained at the table, my coffee growing cold as I considered the implications of our conversation. What had begun as a simple hiking trip had expanded into something unrecognizable, a dark web of extremism, trafficking, and violence operating in the shadows of America's wilderness. And somewhere within that web, Jake had been caught, silenced for knowing too much, for seeing what others had missed or ignored. The thought filled me with both grief and a growing sense of responsibility. If his work, his discovery, had indeed been meaningful, then perhaps there was value in ensuring it wasn't forgotten or suppressed. I left the coffee shop with a strange mixture of dread and resolve. Whatever came next, I would face it with open eyes, honoring Jake's memory by refusing to look away from uncomfortable truths, even when that gaze invited danger. The forest that had once been a place of sanctuary had been irreversibly transformed in my mind. But perhaps understanding its darkness was the only way to reclaim what it had taken from us. Not through denial or forgetting, but through confrontation with the truth, however terrifying that truth might be. In the end, that may have been Jake's most important legacy to me. Not our years of shared adventure, but this final lesson, that some journeys, once begun, cannot be abandoned, even when they lead into shadow. The mountains had always called to me. Since childhood, I'd found solace in the vastness of untamed landscapes, places where human footprints disappeared with the changing seasons and where silence had genuine weight. By my late 20s, these wilderness excursions had evolved into a ritual, one I shared with 3 close friends from college, Jackson, Will, and Bennett. Together, we'd traversed countless trails across North America, from the mist-shrouded paths of the Appalachian Trail to the sun-baked ridges of the Grand Canyon. Our annual hiking trips had become sanctuary from our increasingly complicated lives. We were no longer the carefree college students who could disappear into the backcountry for weeks at a time. Now we had careers, mortgages, and relationships that demanded our presence. These expeditions had become precious interludes, brief returns to a simpler existence. June 2017 marked our planned journey to Yellowstone National Park. I remember checking the weather forecast obsessively in the days leading up to our departure, anxiety building as I watched thunderstorm warnings flashing across my screen. The others had laughed at my meteorological fixation during our video call the night before departure. "Weather changes every 15 minutes in the mountains," Jackson had said, his beard now flecked with premature gray. "We've hiked through worse." He wasn't wrong. We'd endured blizzards in Colorado and flash floods in Arizona. Weather was as much a part of the wilderness experience as blisters and granola bars. Yet something about this trip felt different before it had even begun. A heaviness had settled in my chest, like the atmospheric pressure drop before a violent storm. Will had noticed my uncharacteristic quiet during that call. "Getting cold feet, buddy? We can always hit a resort instead. Room service, hot tubs, overpriced cocktails." His attempt at levity had worked, momentarily dispersing the inexplicable dread I'd been feeling. "And miss the opportunity to smell your unwashed hiking socks for 4 days? Not a chance," I'd retorted, falling back into our familiar patterns of banter. Bennett, always the most practical of our group, had interrupted our exchange with logistics, departure times, gear checklists, emergency contacts. His methodical nature had saved us more than once over the years, though we'd never admit it to his face. None of us could have anticipated what awaited us in Yellowstone's remote backcountry. The memories of that trip have embedded themselves in my psyche like shards of glass, impossible to extract without causing further damage. Even now, 7 years later, certain sounds or scents can instantly transport me back to those mountains, to the moment when our understanding of wilderness, and perhaps humanity itself, fundamentally changed. I've struggled with whether to document what happened, whether giving form to these memories might somehow intensify their hold on me. But perhaps confronting them is the only path forward. So I'll begin where all nightmares begin. With an ordinary day, unremarkable in every way except for what would follow. We arrived at Yellowstone's eastern entrance shortly after dawn, having driven through the night in Bennett's aging but reliable SUV. The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine and mineral-rich soil as we shouldered our packs and checked our GPS coordinates one final time before losing reliable signal. Our destination was a remote alpine lake, nestled approximately 18 miles from the nearest marked trail. The isolation was precisely what had drawn us to this particular location, the promise of pristine wilderness untouched by the typical Yellowstone crowds. According to satellite imagery and topographical maps, the lake sat at roughly 7,200 feet, surrounded by peaks that soared well above 10,000 feet. "Perfect weather for a death march," Will remarked dryly, squinting at the cloudless sky as we began our trek. The first several miles followed an established trail, where we occasionally encountered other hikers, nodding acknowledgments as we passed. By early afternoon, we'd reached our divergence point, where we would leave the marked path and begin navigating by compass and topographical features. "Last chance to turn back," Bennett said, though we all knew it was mere formality. None of us would suggest abandoning our plans this early. The terrain grew steadily more challenging as we pushed further from established routes. What had begun as a gentle incline transformed into steep switchbacks that forced us to use our hands for balance, grasping exposed tree roots and jutting rocks. Our conversation dwindled to occasional grunts and necessary directional calls. By late afternoon, our shirts clung to our backs with sweat, and our legs burned with the effort of the climb. But the scenery rewarded our exertion. Vast expanses of untouched wilderness stretched in every direction, with distant mountains cutting sharp silhouettes against the deepening blue sky. "There," Jackson pointed toward a depression between two ridgelines. "Should be just beyond that next rise." We arrived at the lake just as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks. The water stretched before us, mirror still and reflecting the surrounding cliffs in perfect detail. It was smaller than we'd anticipated, perhaps half a mile across at its widest point, but undeniably beautiful. "Worth every blister," Will declared, already shrugging off his pack. We established camp on a relatively flat section of shoreline, each falling into our well-practiced roles. Jackson filtered water while Bennett assembled our portable stove. Will and I erected the tents, strategically positioning them to shield against the wind that would inevitably sweep down from the peaks after nightfall. As darkness descended, we gathered around our small cook stove, passing a flask of whiskey while our freeze-dried meals rehydrated. The conversation flowed easily, covering the mundane details of our respective lives that we'd missed in the months since our last gathering. Jackson described his ongoing divorce proceedings with surprising detachment. Will shared anecdotes from his surgical residency. Bennett remained characteristically reserved about his government cybersecurity work, though he did mention an upcoming international assignment. I contributed little, finding myself increasingly distracted by our surroundings. As night solidified around us, the wilderness seemed to compress, drawing closer. The vastness that had been so evident during daylight hours somehow constricted in the darkness, as though the mountains were slowly bending toward us. "Earth to daydreamer," Will snapped his fingers near my face. "You planning to actually eat that food you've been stirring for the last 5 minutes?" I forced a laugh, attributing my distraction to altitude fatigue. But as we eventually retreated to our tents, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, not by anything human, but by the landscape itself, ancient and indifferent to our presence. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds that echoed across the lake. The crack of distant branches, the hollow call of night birds, and occasionally, something that resembled footsteps circling our campsite, though none of us would acknowledge this last observation until much later. Dawn arrived with merciful brightness, dispelling the unsettling impressions of the night. We emerged from our tents to find the lake shrouded in a thin layer of mist that would burn away within the hour. After a breakfast of instant coffee and protein bars, we decided to attempt one of the nearby peaks, a nameless summit that rose approximately 10,500 feet above sea level. "Proper acclimation would mean waiting another day," Bennett reminded us, always the voice of caution. "Since when have we done anything properly?" Jackson countered, already repacking his day pack with water and emergency supplies. We left our campsite intact, marking our location on GPS before beginning the ascent. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as we climbed, transitioning from forest to alpine meadow to exposed rock face. Conversation waned as we conserved energy, the thinning air demanding greater effort for even basic exertion. By midday, we'd reached what appeared to be the summit, a relatively flat plateau offering panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. The vastness was humbling. From this elevation, we could see the curvature of the earth, mountains rolling toward the horizon like frozen waves. "Worth the oxygen deprivation," Will gasped, dropping onto a sun-warmed boulder. We scattered across the plateau, each finding our own space to absorb the magnitude of the landscape. I'd wandered perhaps 50 yards from the others when I heard Bennett call out, "Guys, come look at this." Something in his tone, a strain of uncertainty I'd rarely heard from him, immediately set me on edge. I jogged toward his voice, joining Jackson and Will as they converged on Bennett's position near the eastern edge of the plateau. He stood motionless, staring downward. Following his gaze, I saw it, a horse skull, bleached bone white by sun and weather, resting amidst a scatter of loose stones. "Trail riders don't come this high," Jackson said, voicing what we were all thinking. Bennett crouched beside the skull, careful not to touch it. No other bones, just the head. The skull's empty eye sockets seemed to watch us as we circled it, maintaining an instinctive distance. The bone was completely clean, no tissue remained, no scent of decay. Nature's cleaning process is thorough but slow. This skull had been exposed to the elements for months, possibly years. "Maybe a mountain lion dragged it up here," Will suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Jackson shook his head. "Predators don't typically separate skulls so cleanly from the rest of the skeleton, and they certainly don't carry heavy bones to higher elevations." I removed my phone, snapping several photos of the skull from different angles. "Bizarre souvenir of the trip," I said, attempting to lighten the mood, though the hollow feeling in my stomach suggested I'd failed even to convince myself. "Someone brought it here," Bennett concluded, his expression unreadable. "Deliberately." The implication hung between us, that we might not be as alone in this supposedly remote wilderness as we'd believed. The vast openness of the plateau suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. "Let's head back down," I suggested, and no one argued. As we descended, I found myself repeatedly glancing over my shoulder, scanning the landscape for movement. The majesty of the mountain had somehow transformed in the hour since our discovery. What had seemed awe-inspiring now felt vaguely threatening, as though the wilderness itself had revealed an aspect we hadn't previously perceived. We returned to camp in near silence, each absorbed in private thoughts. The lake that had seemed so inviting the previous evening now appeared opaque, concealing unknown depths. The surrounding forest, which had provided comfortable shelter, now suggested countless hiding places. "You're all being ridiculous," Will finally declared as we slumped around our unlit cook stove. "It's just a skull. Probably been there for years." "Probably," Bennett agreed, though without conviction. But the discovery had altered something fundamental in our perception, introducing an element of human interference where we'd expected only natural processes. Someone had brought that skull to the summit. Someone strong enough to carry it up the same punishing terrain we just navigated, and with motivation we couldn't begin to comprehend. That evening, we found ourselves huddling closer together than usual, our conversation subdued and frequently interrupted by extended silences during which we all seemed to be listening intently to the surrounding wilderness. By the following morning, the unease spawned by our discovery had partially subsided, replaced by the more immediate discomforts of wilderness living, specifically the layer of dried sweat and grime that coated our skin after 2 days without washing. "I can smell each of you individually," Will complained over another breakfast of instant coffee and protein bars. "I'm distinguishing unique bouquets at this point." "Like you're any better," Jackson retorted, throwing a pine cone that bounced harmlessly off Will's shoulder. The lake beckoned with its clear, cold water. Despite the residual discomfort from yesterday's discovery, the prospect of washing away days of accumulated filth proved irresistible. "We should spread out along the shore," Bennett suggested, practical as always. "Give each other some privacy." We gathered our biodegradable soap and clean clothing, then dispersed along the lake shore. The shoreline's irregular shape, punctuated by small ridges and clusters of trees, provided natural partitions. I selected a spot approximately 200 yards from our campsite, where a gentle slope of smooth stones provided easy access to deeper water. The air temperature hovered in the mid-70s, warm by mountain standards, but the lake water retained the numbing cold of snowmelt. I removed my boots and socks first, allowing my feet to acclimate to the temperature before committing to full immersion. The water clarity was remarkable. I could see every detail of the lake bed, watching small fish dart between submerged rocks. I'd removed my shirt and was unfastening my belt when I heard it. Jackson's voice, distant but clear, calling for us to come quickly. Something in his tone triggered an immediate response. I abandoned my washing plans, hastily grabbing my shirt and boots without putting them on. The lakeshore was uneven, forcing me to pick my path carefully over slippery rocks and through dense undergrowth. I followed the sound of voices, eventually climbing a small ridge that separated my chosen washing spot from what appeared to be a secluded cove. As I crested the ridge, I saw them, Jackson, Will, and Bennett, standing in a loose semicircle facing away from me. They were unnaturally still, like figures in a tableau. Will wore only his hiking shorts, his bare torso pale against the darker background of pine trees. Bennett was fully dressed, but missing one boot. Jackson stood slightly apart, his hand raised to his mouth in what appeared to be a gesture of shock or revulsion. I called out as I approached, but none of them responded or turned. It wasn't until I drew alongside them that I understood their stillness, understood what had transfixed them so completely. Before us, partially submerged in the shallow water of the cove, lay the carcass of a horse. The animal was massive, a draft horse perhaps, with a coat that might once have been chestnut but was now mottled with decay and water damage. Its legs extended rigidly, and its bloated body had been dragged partially onto the shore, revealing the horror that had silenced my friends. The horse had no head. The separation wasn't ragged or torn. There was a precision to it that suggested deliberate removal rather than predator activity. The neck ended in a clean line just below where the skull would have connected. "Jesus," Will whispered, then immediately corrected himself. "God Almighty." None of us moved closer. The carcass showed signs of having been in the water for some time, perhaps a week or more based on the state of decomposition, but not long enough to account for the completely clean, dry skull we'd found on the mountain peak. "Could be a coincidence," Bennett said without conviction. "Different horses." Jackson shook his head slowly. "What are the odds of finding two separate dead horses in the same remote area? One missing its head, the other just a skull." Will took an unsteady step backward. "This isn't right. We need to report this to rangers." "We're 18 miles from the nearest marked trail," I reminded him. "At least a full day's hike to reach a ranger station." A heavy silence descended as we absorbed the implications of our situation, isolated in remote backcountry with evidence of something disturbing and inexplicable. Bennett was the first to recover his composure. "We should document this before deciding our next move." The suggestion was rational, appealing to our need for concrete action in the face of something we couldn't immediately comprehend. Jackson retrieved his phone from his pocket, moving closer to take photographs of the headless carcass from multiple angles. I found myself scanning our surroundings, suddenly hyper-aware of the dense forest that pressed close to the lakeshore. The wilderness that had seemed so pristine, so empty of human interference, now felt watchful, as though we had stumbled into someone's private domain, a place where rules and understandings different from our own prevailed. Will voiced what we were all thinking. Someone did this. Recently. And with that simple statement, the wilderness transformed around us. No longer a neutral landscape of rock and water and living things, it became a potential hiding place for someone, or something, capable of deliberate cruelty on a scale none of us had encountered before. While Jackson documented the headless horse with his camera phone, Will paced restlessly along the shoreline. Whether from nervous energy or a need to establish a perimeter, I couldn't be sure. Bennett crouched near the water's edge, examining the ground with the methodical attention he brought to everything. "Tracks here," he announced, gesturing toward a section of muddy shoreline. Human boots, fairly recent, size 11 or 12. We gathered around the impressions. Distinct treads pressed into the soft earth, partially filled with water, but still clearly defined. The implication was unavoidable. Someone had been here, likely within the past day or two, given the clarity of the prints despite recent rainfall. Could be another hiker, I suggested without conviction, who happened upon a headless horse carcass and decided not to report it. Jackson countered. Will had continued his shoreline inspection, moving several yards away toward a cluster of partially submerged rocks. "Guys," he called, his voice tight with tension. "There's something else." We joined him, following his gaze to what initially appeared to be debris caught among the rocks, thin brown strips that rippled gently in the water's movement. But as Bennett leaned closer, his breath caught audibly. "That's film," he said, reaching carefully to extract one of the strips from the water. "Photographic negatives." The realization struck us simultaneously. Not digital photography from a modern device, but analog film, deliberately developed and then discarded or lost at this remote location. Bennett held the strip up to the sunlight, and we gathered close, momentarily forgetting the headless carcass behind us. The negatives revealed a series of images in reverse exposure. White where there should be black, dark where there should be light. But even with this inversion, the subject was unmistakable. "It's the horse," Jackson whispered, before decomposition set in. The negative showed the same animal we'd discovered, positioned similarly along the shoreline but in a significantly fresher state. And like our discovery, the horse in the photograph was headless, the neck ending in the same clean, deliberate line. Will scrambled to gather more film strips from among the rocks, his earlier caution forgotten in the rush to piece together this macabre puzzle. Each strip contained similar images, the headless horse photographed from various angles, with meticulous attention to detail. "These weren't taken for documentation," Bennett observed, his voice clinical but with an underlying tremor. "This is aesthetic, composed." He was right. The photographs weren't hasty snapshots, but carefully framed images, the work of someone who had arranged their subject, considered lighting and composition, and captured the scene with artistic intent. "Who carries analog film equipment into the backcountry?" I asked, though the question was largely rhetorical. In an age of digital convenience, the deliberate choice of film seemed significant, anachronistic and somehow more disturbing for its methodical requirements. Film photography demanded patience. Development required chemicals, darkness, precise timing. Whoever had created these images had either transported developed negatives back into the wilderness, or, more unsettlingly, had the means to develop film here in the backcountry. "The negatives haven't been here long," Bennett noted, examining the condition of the film. "No significant water damage or decomposition of the emulsion, days at most, not weeks." Jackson, who had moved slightly away from our group, suddenly dropped into a crouch, pointing toward a section of pebbled beach. "Look at this. The film wasn't washed up, it was weighted down." We joined him, observing how several larger stones had been deliberately placed atop film strips, presumably to prevent them from washing away. This wasn't accidental debris, but intentional placement. Recent enough that whoever left these might still be in the area. Will verbalized our collective thought, his gaze sweeping the surrounding forest with new wariness. The implications assembled themselves with terrible clarity. Someone had killed a horse, removed its head with surgical precision, photographed the result using anachronistic technology, developed the images, and then returned to the scene days later to place the negatives near the decaying carcass. All in wilderness so remote we'd believed ourselves utterly alone. Bennett carefully collected the film strips, placing them in a waterproof pocket of his hiking pants. None of us questioned his actions. Documentation seemed essential, though for what purpose? Evidence, protection, understanding remained unclear. As we stepped back from the water's edge, The forest around us seemed to contract, the spaces between trees suddenly pregnant with potential concealment. The vastness that had earlier provided a sense of freedom now emphasized our isolation, miles from assistance, surrounded by countless hiding places, in territory familiar to someone who clearly operated by logic we couldn't comprehend. "We need to leave," Will stated flatly. "Now." No one disagreed. Returning to camp took on the quality of a tactical operation. Though we'd seen no direct evidence of human presence beyond the boot prints and film negatives, our awareness had fundamentally shifted. The wilderness was no longer empty. It contained someone whose actions suggested a disturbing detachment from normal behavioral constraints. "We'll pack efficiently, essential items only," Bennett directed as we reached our tents. "Be ready to move in 15 minutes. No one questioned his authority in this moment. Bennett's military background, usually manifested only in his methodical approach to outdoor preparation, now emerged more fully in his capacity for crisis management. As we packed, I found myself repeatedly scanning our surroundings, flinching at ordinary wilderness sounds, the rustle of wind through pine needles, the distant call of birds. Every shadow between trees suggested potential observation. "What about reporting this?" Jackson asked, stuffing his sleeping bag with uncharacteristic carelessness. "Rangers should know there's someone out here, doing whatever this is." "We'll report it once we're safely out," Bennett replied, not pausing in his efficient packing. "First priority is distance." Will had been unusually quiet since our discovery, his normally animated features drawn into an expression of concentrated focus. "Whoever did this knows the terrain better than we do," he observed. "They've been methodical, planned, not impulsive." The assessment was unsettling precisely because it rang true. The skull placement at high elevation, the precision of the decapitation, the deliberate photography and return to the scene, all suggested calculated actions rather than random violence. "Which means they might have monitored typical approach routes," Bennett agreed. "We should avoid retracing our entry path." This proposition added complications. Our original route had been selected for navigability. Alternative paths would likely involve more challenging terrain. But none of us argued against the strategic logic. Within 20 minutes, we had dismantled our camp, leaving minimal evidence of our presence. Bennett consulted his topographical map, tracing a finger along a potential exit route that would take us southeast, rather than returning west along our entry path. "Steeper descent here," he indicated, "but it connects to a game trail that should eventually join the marked path about 5 miles further south than where we entered." Under different circumstances, we might have debated the merits of various routes, weighing difficulty against efficiency. Now, we simply nodded, shouldering our hastily packed bags without complaint. As we prepared to depart, a final unsettling observation struck me. Our campsite, selected for its relatively flat, comfortable terrain, offered excellent visibility of the surrounding area, yet simultaneously made us easily observable from multiple vantage points in the surrounding heights. We had prioritized comfort over security, never considering that such calculations might be necessary in this remote location. We moved out in tight formation, with Bennett taking point and Jackson covering our rear. The heightened vigilance transformed what would normally have been an enjoyable, if challenging, hike into something that more closely resembled an extraction under potential threat. The terrain proved even more difficult than anticipated. The southeastern approach from the lake involved navigating a steep scree slope where loose rocks shifted treacherously underfoot. We descended in silence, broken only by the occasional warning about unstable footing or low-hanging branches. Approximately 2 hours into our retreat, we reached a narrow ravine where the path, little more than a game trail at this point, forced us into single file. Rock walls rose sharply on either side, creating a natural bottleneck. I noticed Bennett's hesitation as we approached. "I don't like this," he muttered, scanning the ridgeline above. "Too constricted." But the alternatives involved significantly longer routes or impossibly steep terrain. After a brief pause to assess, we proceeded through the ravine, moving as quickly as safety allowed. The tension peaked as we navigated this constricted passage. Every falling pebble, every brush of fabric against stone, seemed magnified in the enclosed space. The ravine extended for perhaps a quarter mile before gradually widening, our collective relief almost palpable as the walls receded. We had covered approximately 7 miles from our original campsite when Bennett called our first substantial break. We collapsed onto fallen logs and rocks, gulping water and reassessing our position. According to the map, we had another 11 miles before reaching the marked trail where we might encounter other hikers. We should be able to make at least another 6 miles before nightfall, Bennett calculated, studying the angle of the sun. The prospect of darkness was something none of us had directly addressed. The necessity of spending another night in the backcountry hung between us, unspoken but unavoidable. If we push hard, could we make it all the way out before dark? Will asked, voicing our collective preference. Bennett shook his head. Not safely. The terrain gets more technical ahead, and attempting it in failing light would be risking injury. The logic was sound but unsatisfying. Another night in the wilderness with its newfound potential threats stretched before us like a dark promise. We rested only briefly before continuing our descent, each of us privately calculating the distance between our current position and safety, between exposure and shelter, between isolation and the protective presence of others. As afternoon transitioned toward evening, the forest grew denser, the light filtering through the canopy in increasingly oblique patterns. Shadows lengthened, creating pockets of premature darkness among the trees. Every darkened recess seemed to contain potential observation. We need to select a defensible position before full darkness, Bennett eventually stated, verbalizing the security concerns we all felt. The term defensible, so out of place in what should have been simply a recreational activity, underscored how profoundly our wilderness experience had transformed in the hours since discovering the headless horse and its photographer's calling card. We established our emergency camp on a small plateau backed against a cliff face, providing security from one direction at least. Bennett directed us to construct a minimal camp. No fire, cold rations only, tents pitched close together rather than spread for privacy. We'll establish a watch rotation, he decided, using a tone that invited no debate. 2-hour shifts, 2 people per shift, no one alone. The arrangement meant reduced sleep for all of us, but the alternative, unwatched vulnerability throughout the night, was unthinkable after what we'd discovered. As darkness descended completely, sounds that would have been merely atmospheric the previous night now carried potential significance. The crack of branches underfoot could be nocturnal animals or human movement. Wind through pine boughs could mask deliberate approach. Even the calls of night birds seemed to contain patterns that suggested communication rather than natural behavior. Will and I took the first watch, positioning ourselves at opposite edges of our small camp, creating a perimeter of awareness while Bennett and Jackson attempted to rest. "This is insane," Will whispered after nearly 30 minutes of tense silence. "We're letting horse parts and some weird photography hobby drive us into paranoia." The rational assessment did nothing to dispel the visceral unease that had settled into our collective consciousness. Something fundamental had been violated, not just the horse whose mutilation was disturbing enough, but our understanding of wilderness itself. The backcountry was supposed to be challenging but fundamentally comprehensible. What we'd encountered operated outside those understandings. "It's not just the horse," I replied, keeping my voice low. "It's the deliberateness of it all, the staging, the return to place the negatives." Will nodded slowly. "The ritual aspect." That was it precisely, the sense of witnessing evidence of some private ceremony or practice, governed by logic we couldn't access. The horse skull placed at high elevation, the headless body positioned along the shoreline, the carefully composed photographs, the deliberate placement of negatives near the decomposing subject. Each element suggested meaning rather than randomness. Our watch passed without incident, and we woke Bennett and Jackson for the second shift. I crawled into my tent, fully clothed including boots, with my pack positioned for immediate grabbing. Sleep seemed impossible under the circumstances, yet exhaustion eventually overcame hypervigilance. I awakened to Bennett's hand on my shoulder, his voice tight with urgency. "Stay absolutely quiet. Listen." Instantly alert, I strained to identify what had prompted his warning. At first, I heard only the ambient sounds of the wilderness at night, then distinguished it. Rhythmic movement through underbrush, approximately 50 yards from our position. Not the random patterns of wildlife, but the deliberate progression of something large, moving with purpose. "Jackson spotted a light," Bennett whispered close to my ear. Brief flash, like someone using a red-filtered headlamp, coming from the ridge above. We remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe as the sounds continued. Measured footsteps moving parallel to our position, neither approaching nor retreating, but maintaining a consistent distance. Occasionally, branches would crack underfoot, followed by prolonged silence as though the source had paused to listen or observe. This continued for approximately 20 minutes, the presence neither revealing itself fully nor departing, but establishing what felt intentionally like awareness of our location without direct confrontation. Eventually, the sounds receded, moving gradually eastward until they faded entirely. We remained frozen in position for what seemed an eternity, none of us willing to break the silence that might reveal our exact location. "Could have been an animal," Will finally suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Bennett shook his head slightly. "Red light filter. Someone's out there." The remainder of the night passed in hyper-vigilant rotation, our watch shifts reduced to 1 hour to combat fatigue. None of us achieved meaningful rest. By the time first light filtered through the trees, we were already packed and prepared to move, eager to escape the oppressive sense of being monitored from just beyond our perceptual boundaries. Our descent resumed with renewed urgency. The physical discomforts of rapid hiking through challenging terrain, blisters, muscle fatigue, minor scrapes from branches, registered as inconsequential compared to the psychological burden of potential observation. We encountered the first sign of regular human presence, a clearly maintained trail marker, shortly after noon. The simple wooden sign, weathered but official, prompted an almost embarrassing surge of relief. We had reached the edge of true isolation, entering terrain where others reliably passed. 8 more miles to the trailhead, Bennett calculated, consulting his map. We covered that distance with a steady determination born of collective urgency, encountering a handful of day hikers moving in the opposite direction. Their casual greetings and ordinary equipment, water bottles rather than filtration systems, light day packs instead of expedition gear, emphasized our transition back toward normal human patterns. We reached Bennett's SUV by late afternoon, collapsing against it with the exhausted relief of soldiers returning from combat. The ordinary objects in the vehicle, spare clothing, forgotten snack wrappers, a forgotten paperback on the back seat, seemed artifacts from a different reality, one governed by comprehensible patterns and predictable causality. "Ranger station?" Jackson suggested as we loaded our gear. Bennett nodded, starting the engine. "We report this, all of it." The ranger's expression shifted from professional courtesy to focused concern as our account progressed. Initially, she seemed to categorize us as typical hikers reporting ordinary wildlife observations. But as Bennett methodically described our discoveries, the horse skull at elevation, the headless carcass by the lake, the carefully placed photographic negatives, her demeanor transformed. "You have the negatives?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Bennett produced the sealed plastic bag containing the film strips we'd collected. The ranger accepted it without touching the contents directly, instead placing it inside an evidence envelope. "And approximate GPS coordinates for both locations?" We provided the data from our devices, watching as she marked positions on a large topographical map of the park's backcountry. I noticed her adding our discovery to other markers already present on the map. Small red pins clustered in several remote areas. "We're not the first to report something like this, are we?" Will observed. The ranger's hesitation was brief but telling. "We've had reports of unusual findings in the backcountry, nothing conclusively connected. But similar enough that you're tracking them," Bennett pressed. She studied us for a moment, apparently assessing how much information to share with civilians. "There have been several reports over the past 3 years of animal remains positioned in what appear to be deliberate arrangements, primarily in very remote areas, primarily discovered by experienced backcountry users like yourselves." "And the photography aspect?" I asked. Another hesitation. "You're the third group to report finding photographic documentation near displays. First with negatives, though. Previous reports involved Polaroid photographs." The information sent a chill through me despite the ranger station's comfortable warmth. Not isolated incidents, then, but a pattern, evolving but consistent in its fundamental aspects. "Do you have any suspects?" Jackson asked. The ranger closed her notebook with deliberate care. "I can't discuss ongoing investigations, but I can tell you we're taking this very seriously. Your report is valuable, particularly the detail about movement near your camp during the night. We provided contact information and formal statements, a process that occupied several hours. By the time we departed the ranger station, darkness had fallen again, though this time punctuated by the reassuring artificial lights of civilization. That should have been the conclusion, a disturbing wilderness encounter, properly reported to authorities, relegated to anecdote status. But 7 years later, I find the experience has not receded, but rather has periodically resurfaced with unexpected clarity. I still hike, though never again in Yellowstone's backcountry. My annual trips with Jackson, Will, and Bennett continued for several years afterward, though with subtle adjustments. Preferences for popular, well-traveled routes, avoidance of truly remote locations, a collective unspoken gravitation toward trails where regular ranger patrols were known to operate. Eventually, our group expeditions tapered as life intervened. Bennett accepted an overseas assignment. Will's surgical practice demanded increasing time. Jackson relocated to the Pacific Northwest after finalizing his divorce. We maintain contact through sporadic video calls and occasional one-on-one visits, but our collective wilderness adventures have become archival rather than ongoing. I followed news reports about Yellowstone for years afterward, searching for any mention of unusual discoveries or arrests related to what we'd encountered. Nothing conclusive ever emerged publicly. Occasional vague references to vandalism or wildlife harassment in extremely remote areas suggested continued activity, but details remained sparse. 3 years after our experience, I received an unexpected email from the ranger who had taken our report. She offered no specifics, but did mention that our information had contributed significantly to an ongoing federal investigation. She thanked us for our detailed observations and advised that we might be contacted by federal authorities, though such contact never materialized. Sometimes during otherwise ordinary moments, standing in line at a grocery store, sitting in traffic, attending a workplace meeting, I am suddenly overtaken by the memory of those negatives held up against mountain sunlight, revealing their inverted images of deliberate mutilation. Or I recall the measured footsteps circling our camp in darkness, the brief flash of filtered red light among distant trees. In these moments, I'm reminded that wilderness represents more than geographical remoteness. It can also describe psychological territory, spaces beyond normal constraints, where actions that would be immediately identified and contained in civilization can unfold according to private logic, visible only through their careful documentation. I've come to believe that what we encountered was neither supernatural nor particularly mysterious in itself. Rather, we glimpsed evidence of human behavior operating beyond social boundaries, in terrain where oversight is minimal and private ritual can develop uninterrupted. The wilderness amplified this encounter not through any inherent quality, but through the stark contrast it provided: beauty against cruelty, vastness against intimate detail, natural processes against deliberate interference. The national parks brochures warn visitors about bears, unpredictable weather, and treacherous terrain. They suggest proper equipment, adequate water, and appropriate emergency preparations. They never mention the possibility of encountering evidence that the human capacity for disturbing behavior extends even into supposedly pristine wilderness. That someone might be watching from beyond the firelight, documenting their private ceremonies, and occasionally allowing others glimpses of practices governed by impenetrable personal mythology. Our hiking group's unspoken motto had always been that the scariest thing in the wilderness was the occasional uncomfortable outdoor bathroom situation. We were wrong. The truly frightening element was what we brought with us. Human consciousness with its capacity for both transcendent appreciation and unfathomable cruelty, existing simultaneously in the same magnificent landscape.